Welcome everyone to the opening event of Prajna's 2022 16 Days campaign against gender violence. As we have done over the last few years, we are starting the campaign by launching the 2022 Gender Violence in India report. This is a document that we have been publishing since 2009, and it really underscores one of Prajna's core purposes, which is to create freely accessible and information-rich documents that further our goal of public education through careful research. What you see in the 2022 report is not simply a reflection of our efforts this year, but really a living document that has been built on, adapted, and extended since 2009, when the report was only 14 pages long, to the over 100-page manuscript you see today. We have also changed the format of the report this year a little bit to reflect our own learning and awareness of how gender-based violence must be viewed through an intersectional lens. We have with us the author of this year's report, Kausumi Saha, and she'll tell you a bit more about the report itself. And I would like to take this opportunity to introduce her. Kausumi Saha works as a researcher and project coordinator at Gender at Work. She has a master's degree in sociology from the Delhi School of Economics and is currently working towards a second postgraduate degree in psychology. Her research interests lie at the intersections of media, youth subcultures, gender, identity formation, and mental health. This is Kausumi's third year working on Prajna's Gender Violence in India report. And I must add, she does this with immense diligence and care every single year. We are also thrilled to have Professor Saumya Uma with us today, who will be delivering a lecture responding to the report and more broadly on gender violence in India. Professor Saumya Uma is a professor at Jindal Global Law School and heads its Center for Women's Rights. She has over 28 years combined work experience as an academic, law researcher, lawyer, trainer, writer, and campaigner on gender law and human rights. She has served as a research consultant for the United Nations Development Fund, United Nations Office of the High Commissioner on Human Rights, and the International Commission of Jurists. Additionally, she worked as the national coordinator of ICC India, that is the anti-impunity campaign of the International Criminal Court, and its relevance to India. She holds degrees from the National Law School of India University, the University of Mumbai, and the University of Nottingham, and completed her PhD at the National Law School, where she wrote her thesis on developing an Indian legal framework on victim and witness protection with a specific reference to gender-based violence. Dr. Uma teaches and researches at the intersection of gender, human rights, and the law. Her work reflects a really interdisciplinary approach to law. She has researched and authored 11 books, edited and co-edited many more books, and also published over 60 book chapters, articles in journals, newspapers, and popular online media platforms. She is presently preparing a book manuscript on violence against women and Indian legal responses. My name is S. Shakti. I help run the research program at Prajnya, and I will be moderating the session today. So we will begin the session now with an introduction to the Gender Violence in India report by Kausumi, which will be followed by Professor Uma's lecture. We will then take questions from the audience. I request everyone to please keep your mics on mute while the speaker is talking. You can, of course, once we are done with the lectures, go ahead and unmute and ask questions. If you have any questions or comments during the talks as well, you can please leave them in the chat box and you will get to them during the Q&A session as well. So over to you now, Kausumi.
Just 1 second. We're having some problem with streaming and I'm asking Amrita to stop and start again. So Kausumi, okay, give us 2 seconds to fix that so people hear the whole presentation.
Sure.
Together. Just 2 minutes.
Live streaming, ma'am, we can start.
Live streaming, ma'am, we can start. Is my screen visible to everyone, and am I audible?
Yes, and yes.
Okay. Thank you, Shakti, for that very kind introduction. And to everyone, a very good morning, and thank you for joining us. As Shakti mentioned, this is the third year that I have the opportunity to work on this report. The report is on a grim topic, but nevertheless, working on it with Shakti, with Swarna has always been a very rewarding experience. So thank you also to Prajnya for doing this very important work, and of course, for making me a part of it. So some of you might be familiar with Prajna's gender violence report. However, for those of you who are new, I'll just give you a brief introduction. Prajna's gender violence in India report takes stock of the state of gender violence in India over the year. We do this using definitions, we use statistics wherever it is available, and we also highlight certain cases of gender-based violence that have made headlines over the years, over the last year. We also review important political, policy-related, important legal changes that have happened over the year, as well as notable judgments. The Prajna Gender Violence in India report primarily uses data from the National Crime Records Bureau, especially the Crime in India report, which is an annual report. However, we do keep in mind that National Crime Records Bureau uses data based on reportage of gender-based violence. Most of us know that what is reported is only a very small statistic of actual instances. So keeping that in mind, we also use data from other state agencies. For instance, the National Family Health Survey has been a very important source of data this year. We also use information published by NGOs, both domestic and international. Finally, the report also contains the FIR Ready Reckoner, which is a very handy guide, a very handy reference for those who would like to file a police case against on an instance of violence. So as Shakti mentioned, over the last few years, we have been grappling with how we can, how the report can present gender-based violence in a more realistic, more inclusive, and more intersectional way. Now, intersectionality is a framework which recognizes that women are not a homogeneous category. The women, they come from different social, different economic backgrounds, they're in different places in our very hierarchical society, and that they do not experience violence in the same way. So for instance, a Savarna woman who is also with a disability would be as vulnerable just like a Dalit woman who is perhaps able-bodied, and they're both vulnerable women, but they may not experience gender-based violence in the same way. So keeping that in mind, and in our quest to make the report more intersectional, we have restructured the report very distinctly this year. So not only do we report on the different kinds of gender-based violence, we also included another subsection, which is on the intersections of gender-based violence. And we included 5 key markers of identity that we believe are relevant in the Indian context when it comes to marginalization, when it comes to vulnerabilities. These are violence against Dalit and Adivasi persons, against LGBTQIA+ persons, against the elderly, against persons with disability, and against religious minorities. Of course, in the coming years, we also hope to include other identity markers that are important in the Indian context, such as ethnic differences, racial differences, linguistic differences, citizenship status, etc. So I'd like to go into a very brief detail of each of the 5 chapters that we have added. Firstly is gender-based violence against Dalit and Adivasi persons. Dalit and Adivasi women face violence both from oppressor castes due to their caste identity, due to their indigenous identity, as well as their gender. They also face violence within their own community because of their gender identity. So this is often called a double marginalization. Also in India, overwhelmingly, Dalit and Adivasi persons belong to working class backgrounds, which adds a third layer of vulnerability due to their class position. It is important to note that almost all kinds of gender-based violence have an element of power attached to it. So when it comes to violence against Dalit women or Adivasi women by oppressor castes, it is usually a demonstration of power. It is a show of power. It is a way of saying that we can harm you and there's nothing you can do about it. And it is weaponized as a way to reinforce existing fault lines, existing hierarchies of caste, of gender, of class, of indigeneity, and so on. Other than that, it's not always sexual violence, but certain discriminatory practices against these communities can often have very, very gendered impacts. Some examples would be bonded labor, modern day slavery, which is still very prevalent, untouchability, manual scavenging, and so on. Adivasi women have especially from forest dwelling communities, have the added context of militarism, colonization, development policies, which have historically proven to be harmful to their lives and their livelihoods. Queer populations are marginalized due to their gender and or sexuality, sexual minority status, and the fact that they have little to no social protection. So when it comes to queer populations, they face the more common forms of gender-based violence, such as sexual assault, such as intimate partner violence, domestic violence, crimes in the name of honor, and so on. But there are also certain kinds of violence which are specific to their identities, which can be, say, corrective rape, forced conversion therapy, usage of electroconvulsive therapy, for instance, and so on. There's also a large amount of symbolic violence that queer populations often face. This can be in the form of non-recognition of their queer identities. It can be in the form of dead naming, which is the practice of using the name that a trans person was born with and that they no longer use, a name that they have changed, or using the wrong pronouns. Their marginalization, their vulnerabilities are exacerbated by the fact that queer populations have little to no legal protection in the Indian context. As we know, Section 377, which criminalized gay sex, was only recently decriminalized. But however, our rape laws still do not recognize rape other than when it is committed by a man against a woman. Similarly, our Trans Act, most recent Trans Act, has been criticized because although it recognizes rape or sexual abuse against trans people, it is considered to be a petty offense, and it is far less, the punishment is far less than our regular rape laws. So all of this also leads to very high rates of custodial violence. Queer populations are disproportionately at risk of violence by police and within custody. Old age leads to another kind of vulnerability, another kind of marginalization, simply because they're often in a position of dependency, and the violence that they face it usually takes place from those who are their caretakers, people who are in positions of power, and this violence can be of many kinds. It can be physical and psychological. It can be economic, because elderly persons are often financially dependent on other people. And of course, it can be sexual. Perpetrators are often family members. Sometimes when it comes to elderly persons living in old age homes, living in rehabilitation centers, it can be the custodians of those centers as well. Disability is also closely related with old age. Old age often leads to certain chronic diseases, which can cause them to become disabled, and disability brings with it its own set of problems, its own set of different kinds of violence. That being said, there's actually little to no research on sexual violence against elderly women, despite the fact that there are many cases that come to the fore simply because of the shame and the stigma that is associated with it. Similarly, women, persons with disabilities, especially women, are often financially dependent. They're socially dependent on others for their survival, which makes them even more prone to certain kinds of violence. And the perpetrators are once again often caregivers, whether it's in the home or whether it's in an institutional setting. And this is exacerbated by the fact that persons with disability often have very little access to justice. Maybe because they are dependent on the very people that are the ones who are abusing them, maybe because of the lack of mobility. And also when it comes to intellectual disabilities or mental disabilities, the police do not consider them credible witnesses and do not take the investigation further. There's also a lot of entrenched violence against persons with disability within the legal system. I mean, our legal language continues to use extremely ableist terms. We use terms like viklang and retardation and so on, which elicit prejudice, which elicit discrimination. We also deny persons with disability certain basic rights. For example, women who are considered to be of unsound mind, they cannot own property, they cannot choose to have children, they cannot adopt, they cannot represent themselves politically, they cannot run for office, nor can they form associations or form or create organizations, which means they're not able to represent their interests by themselves. When it comes to gender-based violence against religious minorities, we have seen that any kind of large-scale communal violence is almost always accompanied by an aspect of sexual violence. It is often a very systemic strategy to destabilize the so-called enemy community. And it doesn't even have to be particular cases of communal violence in certain regions, which are, say, highly militarized. Sexual violence can be an everyday phenomenon for the women in those communities by people in power, and especially, for example, the military. And this is further because of the impunity that is allowed to them by laws that are in existence, such as the AFSPA. Over the last few years, there has been an exponential increase in gender-based violence against women from religious minorities. There are many examples. The whole Sulli Days, Bulibai debacle was an example of online violence, online harassment of Muslim women. There have been open calls for rape of Muslim women, rape of Christian women, which by Hindu priests, politicians, people in power. And only this year there has the Bilkis Bano's rapists were released prematurely, and it is incidents like this which allows for the impunity to continue, which allows for people to continue crimes against religious minorities with no fear of repercussions. There have also been a large number of discriminatory laws and policies over the last few years. And while they are harmful for the overall community, they also have very, very gendered impacts that we need to recognize. The CA&RC, for instance, makes women from any minority community particularly vulnerable, because these women are the ones who generally do not have documents, they do not have identity documents of any kind. The hijab ban, which happened over the last 2 years in Karnataka and parts of UP, there has actually been data which shows that a lot of Muslim girls had to drop out of school, and not just because of a protest, but they were forced to drop out of school because they were no longer allowed to go to school without if they could not wear the hijab. Similarly, the population control bill disproportionately affects women and their reproductive abilities. The anti-conversion bill, what we know more commonly as love jihad, it prevents women from choosing their own partners. So that was a very brief overview of the first 5 chapters. After that, I would like to talk about the National Family Health Survey 5, which came out this year, which was, the survey was done over between 2019 and 21, and it has some, I would like to present some key highlights from it, which is related to gender-based violence. And this is data presented from survey of 1 lakh women across the country. So the National Family Health Survey data states that, the NFHS 5 data states that 30% of the women who were surveyed between the ages of 18 and 49 have experienced physical violence since turning 15. And 6% of women surveyed said that they have been survivors of sexual violence in their lifetime. 2 in 5 women, which means about 40% of women, said that they experienced physical and sexual violence by their husbands or by their partners. And only 14% of women who experienced physical or sexual violence brought it up in any ways. It's not all bad. We also have a bit of good news in this year's NFHS. It says that there has been an increase in the aggregate sex ratio in India. We are right now at a very healthy 1,020 females per 1,000 males. So in the next 2 slides, before I end, I would like to take 2 of these points and go into a little bit more detail. Firstly is the issue of the aggregate sex ratio in India. Like I just said, the NFHS 5 reported that the sex ratio in India has increased to 1,020 females per 1,000 males from the NFHS 4, which was done in 2015 to 16, according to which we had 991 females per 1,000 males. So this was over the course of the last 4 or 5 years that this increase apparently happened. However, there are some key things to keep in mind. Number 1 is that some of the most populated states and union territories in India continue to have a very skewed sex ratio. For instance, Haryana, Punjab, Maharashtra, Delhi, which are very highly populated and do not have a healthy sex ratio. Similarly, the NFHS also found that child sex ratio in India is extremely skewed, because we had only 929 female births per 1,000 males in the last 5 years. Lastly, I'd like to highlight the fact that many scholars who have analyzed the National Family Health Survey 5 have actually warned that there might be some discrepancy in the data collection as a result of the pandemic and the lockdown. To put it very briefly, actually, the first phase of the data collection happened in a few cities, in a few states in 2019 before the pandemic. And the second stage happened in 2021, which was just as the first lockdown just after the first lockdown. So it did not take into account the fact that there was large-scale migration that happened during the lockdown, and it did not account for those people who might have been counted several times. So it is important to note that we must take the data with perhaps a pinch of salt. The second thing I would like to highlight is the dire situation of marital rape in India. The survey, the NFHS reported that 40% of the women surveyed had experienced physical violence or sexual violence by their husbands and partners. We know that marital rape is exempt from Indian rape laws. This is not to say that there is no legal recourse for victims of marital rape. The Domestic Violence Act, the PWDVA, or 498A, which deals with grievous injury, can still be used by the complainant. However, we know from practice that these cases rarely get convicted. Earlier this year, concerning a marital rape case, the Delhi High Court reached a split verdict on the issue of criminalization of marital rape. although one justice was in favor of the criminalization of including marital rape in our existing rape laws, the other justice said that this is not something that can be decided in court. It had to be decided by legislators because there are many cultural, legal, social issues to be taken into consideration. The situation is not all bad. So I'd like to end with two notable progresses that we have had in India over the last year in 2022. Number one is the Supreme Court prohibited the two-finger test in rape cases. The justice stated that it was an unscientific practice, it was a patriarchal practice, and that it re-traumatizes, re-victimizes those survivors of rape. It also said that anyone who is found to be conducting such tests will be held guilty of misconduct. In August, the National Medical Commission released a directive warning doctors that anyone who offered or prescribed any kind of conversion therapy to queer youths, they will be deemed as engaging in professional misconduct, and they will be liable to, there will be disciplinary action that will be taken against them. So those are some of the key highlights from this year's report. This is very brief. Please read the report. It's much more detailed. It's a lot more nuanced. And don't forget to give us any feedback if you have it. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much, Kausumi, especially for giving us such a good overview of the new parts of the report. I will now hand over to Professor Saumya Uma, who will give her lecture.
Thank you, Shakti. Thank you to Prajnya and to Swarna, who has been my long-term friend, for inviting me and giving me this opportunity. I was here as part of the audience last year when the report was released, and I think it was Professor Rukmini Sen who gave the talk. So at that time, I had only had a cursory glance at that report, but this year, I have read this report in detail. And as I was telling Swarna earlier, and Shakti and Kausumi as well, just before this event began today, I think this is a very, very important exercise that has been undertaken, and this is an excellent document. It can serve many purposes. I believe that this was intended to be a ready reckoner for journalists and for people who might want to pick up data immediately for their work and so on. I think it's doing that job, and it's doing much more. Every chapter, for example, it has not only, there are of course statistics in the beginning of the report, and some of those statistics I'm going to revisit. Kausumi has already highlighted some aspects of that, but I'm going to re-engage with some of that. But it has statistics. Every chapter has an analysis of the statistics, focusing on the topic of that chapter. And after that, there is a section which sets out the laws. Then there is a section that gives the recent judgments. And after that, there is a section which talks about recent news. So that kind of gives a very recent update to the entire topic. I think, I'm really fascinated with the way in which the chapters have been organized. And I think this kind of a report can be used by researchers in addition to journalists who may want to pull things out from the report when they are writing their when they are writing their pieces. I think this kind of a report can also be very useful for researchers, for students, for academics, and it can even be used in, litigation and so on. So I see this as a very, very important and very useful exercise, and it's full of footnotes and citations. It cites from various sources, so you can see that there is a high level of credibility that's attached to it as well. So congratulations to Prajnya, to Kausumi, to Shakti for this endeavor. So let me just share screen. I'm going to look at some parts of the statistics and give my make a few observations. And after I do that, I will just pick on a few issues which have already been highlighted. Some of them have been highlighted by Kausumi. I will just elaborate it a little more. So in that sense, this is not going to be like a formal lecture, but it's more like I'm just going to give some of my thoughts and observations, and I hope there will be adequate time for us to have interactions. So as you can see, the first part is which Kausumi actually took us through, talks about the intersections and on Dalits and Adivasi persons, LGBTQIA+, elderly persons, persons with disability, and religious minorities. And the second part deals with various forms of gender-based violence. So this is the table, and this is primarily from the National Crime Record Bureau, and in the chapters there's also other statistics which have been included. These are from NGOs, or it's from human rights organizations which have put together, and so on. So here, one of my first observations is on this aspect of kidnapping and abduction of women and girls. We can see that these statistics are only up to 2021, because Crime in India, which is the report of the NCRB, that hasn't released the 2022 statistics yet. That will be released next year. So if we look at the 2020 and 2021, we see that there is a significant increase in kidnapping and abduction of women and girls, and including for marriage. So one of the thoughts that was going through my mind, and I'm not a numbers person at all, I've been a qualitative researcher throughout my professional life. And yet I think this kind of data tells us so many things. So I'm really tempted to engage with it. So one of the thoughts that was going through my mind was that partly this increase could be due to increased incidents of kidnapping and abduction, but it could also be because there may be more intercaste, interreligious marriages, maybe lesbian couples also leaving their home and going somewhere else and living together, and the parents registering complaints using these sections. We know this has happened in the past. There is a very important article which the feminist historian Uma Chakravarti had written on this aspect, which I often go back to, where she had actually interviewed, she has given excerpts of interviews with police personnel who are complicit with parents in registering complaints of kidnapping, abduction against women who assert their agency and their choice in marriage. And now with an increase in age of marriage of women, this probably is going to increase, because we are going to see an increased parental and community stranglehold on women who want to exercise choice marriages. It could be intercaste, interreligious, interclass, and so on. So that was something that I wanted to highlight. The next thing that I want to highlight is on domestic violence. I'm not sure what provision is the NCRB is using here for this 446 to 507. I don't know if it's getting this from PWDVA Act, but I think that number will be much more. But what I also want to point out is, it's interesting if we look at 498A, cruelty by husbands and relatives, that's section 498A of the IPC. Despite all the propaganda about women misusing 498A, police receiving directives from Commissioner of Police, from Home Ministry, repeatedly saying, inquire prior to registration. There have also been judgments like Rajesh Sharma judgment, which set up committees to have some kind of counseling before even registering the complaints. This was fortunately, reversed by the Supreme Court itself in another judgment. But what I want to point out is that despite all the propaganda and despite all this resistance, institutional reluctance and resistance to register complaints of domestic violence, there is still a sizable number which is getting registered. 1,11,549, and how it's increased to 1,37,234. And in the COVID years, pandemic years, when women were trapped in their homes because of lockdown and because of work from home afterwards, we know that worldwide domestic violence increased during those years. So the 2022 statistics are likely to only show this kind of increase. The other thing that I want to point out here is about dowry, the use of Dowry Prohibition Act. And, there's often this thinking that now dowry harassment and dowry deaths are a non-issue, but we see that there are at least 13,000 odd cases of dowry harassment. So this common myth that dowry harassment has ended is really busted by these statistics, and increasing consumerism must also be contributing to increased dowry harassment. If the dowry harassment was earlier about, giving 1 lakh and 2 lakhs, now it is about giving branded cars and branded jewelry and computer and so on. So it's just that the forms may have changed, but the mentality and the underlying approach, patriarchal approach, remains the same. Then I'm rape and rape by family, friends, neighbors. If we look at these statistics, we see that in the latest statistics that are available, nearly half, or maybe slightly more than half, of the reported cases of rape are by family, friends, neighbors, employers, or other known persons. Yet, what we see, if we look at the law and how the law is being is treating rape, there is an underlying understanding that rape is by strangers. So when rape takes place by a family member, then it's harder to report because there are financial, emotional, or other forms of dependency. When it's by an acquaintance or, what we would call date rapes and, and so on, then it casts aspersions on the woman. She must have consented because she went out with this man, they went to a pub, they had drinks. So, she must have wanted sex, and and her consent is then assumed. So those are some of the things that I want to highlight on rape. Custodial rape, 29 cases in 2020 and 26 in 2021. But there is also there's also something here called other custodial rapes. So I'm not sure what the difference between custodial rape and other custodial rapes is, but then these are rapes by police, rapes by hospitals, by rapes in jails, rapes in any of these government-run places where women are kept in custody, and they are supposed to be there. Government institutions which are supposed to protect them and safeguard their bodily integrity are in fact violating them. So one could be, I'm just looking at what could be the explanation for 47 to 29 to 26. Is it that, less custodial rapes are taking place because justice and accountability systems are in place, they have improved, so there is a deterrence to custodial rape, which would really be great for us? Or is it that lesser and lesser women are registering a complaint because it is futile to do so? I'm not sure what it is. I leave it to our imagination, but those were my thoughts when I went through this data on custodial rape. But in other custodial rapes, we actually see quite a bit of an increase. So that's on custodial rape. Let me see what's street sexual harassment and sexual harassment in public transport and all of this. This is a very, very important aspect because it affects our mobility, and it actually makes us, it forces us to either stay at home, on the questionable presumption that home is safe for women, which we know it isn't, or to deal with this kind of sexual harassment in the public places. And in fact, one of the chapter on sexual harassment in public places, I think it mentions another research which has shown that a lot of these forms of sexual harassment happen in open daylight. So, this idea of, let's fix up more CCTV cameras everywhere, and let's invest in putting lots of lights on the roads, and then sexual harassment will stop. That I think is a very questionable approach. Of course, we want streets to be well lit. Do women want cameras everywhere, CCTV cameras everywhere, recording their every action? That's a question that we really, and whether it is really going to make mobility any safer for us is something that we need to think about. Stalking has also increased, and here I'm thinking of cyber stalking and how now there are apps which kind of which are used to track a person's movement, and even among couples, there's often this dispute, and this I've come to know through my students. They say that a suspicious partner says, I want to know where you are, show me your location through the app, and so on. So I think there are forms of stalking, which cyber stalking, which are not only by strangers but also by partners, romantically inclined partners, and so on. I think it's just kind of increasing the violence that takes place. And I think we need to remember also that stalking and rape and murder are all quite linked. There are many cases where stalking, when it has not been stopped or prevented, has led to rape, and it has also led to murder. Two incidents come to my mind. One is Priyadarshini Mattu, who was stalked, and then she was raped and she was murdered. This was in Delhi. And there's another case from Bombay. I forget the name right now, but it was also a case of stalking and rape and murder. Workplace harassment, sexual harassment. We must remember that although there are criminal law provisions for it, a lot of these cases are also dealt with through the civil law provisions, which are through POSH, through the internal complaints committee and the district complaints committee. Those are also dealing with it, and the report talks quite a bit about sexual harassment at workplace, POSH Act, how the district complaints committees are quite defunct. I think Prajnya itself has filed RTIs regarding the functioning of district inquiry committees in Tamil Nadu. But what I also want to flag here is that, it is the frustration about the lack of effectiveness of these internal complaints committees, which partly led to the whole, Me Too movement and the Hall of Shame, where alleged perpetrators' names were put up and they were shamed. And this led to an intergenerational feminist dialogue on whether we should follow the due process of law, which is these inquiry committees. But what do we do if those inquiry committees are out to shield the perpetrators, or if they are not effective? Then is naming and shaming an option. So those were very interesting discussions and dialogues that took place. Yeah, the last I'm highlighting is about cyber crimes and how the cyber crimes have increased. And in the pandemic years, this is only likely to be more, because women were using, not just women, I mean, everybody was using the internet much more. They were on cyberspace much more because we could not, our mobility outside was restricted. For women who were working in offices, they were working from home, which meant that colleagues were contacting them sometimes through WhatsApp late at night, through through cyberspace. So there were forms of sexual harassment at the workplace, where the workplace has to be expanded and it needs to include the home as well. We of course see increased incidents of crimes against scheduled castes and scheduled tribes. And as Kausumi had pointed out, crimes against scheduled tribes, particularly against Adivasi women, it's also because of, attempt to take over their land by corporate entities, and very often in complicity with the local administration. So those are things that some of the things that this report tells us, particularly in terms of the statistics. Now I just want to, I think I will take about 5 to 10 minutes to highlight a few other things that have happened in recent times. And I want to start with the Shraddha Walkar case, murder case, which has been continuously in the news for several days. And we know that the woman's name is Shraddha, the perpetrator's name is Aftab, and of course it's a gruesome murder where she was killed and then her body parts were cut and kept in the fridge, and then they were disposed of little by little. What I want to highlight here is this is an instance of intimate partner violence. And it is, of course, a gruesome murder, but it has been turned into a Hindu-Muslim issue. And it has been given a spin as if, all Muslim men are barbaric and this is all that they do. These are narratives which we really need to question for ourselves. Has there been no heinous crimes committed by Hindu partners, Hindu husbands or Hindu partners? And I'm just reminded, maybe it's because I'm sitting in North India, I'm reminded of so many of these cases and incidents from North India. And one of the cases is about is this Tandoor case, which I don't know how many of you are aware of it. It was perhaps a decade earlier, but I think it happened in Delhi, where a man killed his wife and then he put her body into the tandoor, which is the hot oven of a restaurant which he owned in Delhi, and the man was not a Muslim. So I'm just, trying to say how, we are not, the media is of course giving it this spin, but we need to look at domestic violence, intimate partner violence, patriarchy, misogyny, Indian masculinity, and the everyday violence that women are facing in relationships. And I see a lot of this, I mean, I hear a lot of this from my students as well. So, it is not, we think that the younger generation is very liberated in some sense, but they too are in that same trap of patriarchy and misogyny to a large extent. And what I want to also question about this Shraddha murder case is, why is so little being talked about natal family violence? and why is so little responsibility being attributed to her parents? Because she exercised a choice in relationship, and she exercised her agency in being in a relationship with a Muslim. Her parents disowned her or disassociated her, and it was several months after her murder that her father even lodged a complaint. So for several months, the parents did not know whether their daughter was alive or dead, and they did not even inquire. And it was only after several months that the complaint was filed. So I think it tells us a lot about parental approach to daughters exercising agency in relationships. And I think that's an important aspect for us to think about, because honor killings are in the rise, and this kind of anything that goes like intercaste, interclass, interreligious relationships. And we are often told that because she went against her parents' wishes, she got punished for that. So, this kind of discourse is, of course, very disturbing. And now the father says that the perpetrator should get death penalty, right? So that's another thing for us to actually question and counter, right? So firstly, for so many months, he didn't even bother to find out or be in touch with his daughter. And after she has been killed so gruesomely, now it's about death penalty. And we know that there is death penalty even for some of the most gruesome aspects of rape. And that is against women's movement's position, which has always been that death penalty is not going to reduce the number of rapes that happen. In fact, the raped woman will then is likely to be killed. And we have a judgment which says, yes, he raped her, but then he allowed her to live. So mehrbani kiya, he was very, very generous and charitable enough to allow her to live. So and that was used as a mitigating circumstance. So I think these are things for us to think about, how there needs to be timely action before the domestic violence escalates to murder, and how can we make institutions responsive and responsible for that. So I think that's something that I want to flag. The next issue very quickly is on marital rape. And of course, Kausumi has already talked about marital rape. I mean, there has been the split verdict by the Delhi High Court. And I just want to highlight what this means for us, right? So so there is this marital rape exemption in the provision on rape. So rape, the act is the same, the impact of the rape is the same. Maybe the impact of the rape is more on the wife, because she has to live with the rapist day in and day out, and make herself more and more vulnerable to repeated rape. And yet, because the perpetrator is a man who has married her, there is an exemption from the provision of rape. So one of the judges, Justice Rajiv Shakdar, he said that this exemption is unconstitutional and it should be struck down. Whereas another judge, Judge Harishankar, Justice Harishankar said that it is required for protection of the institution of marriage. So I think this is a question for all of us. If we are not safe in our marriages, and if the rape that happens within marriage is not considered to be rape, why should we marry at all? I think it's just a larger question. I'm just throwing up maybe some provocative questions for us to have a discussion. Yes, there are other remedies. There are remedies in Domestic Violence Act. There are remedies of 498A. But the fact that the criminal law on rape actually exempts husbands, I think normatively that's very, very bad in law for all women, and it's just a kind of discrimination, very blatant kind of discrimination, which I think is something that we need to look at. So it brings us back to the question of consent. When a woman gets married, does she consent to, does she hand over her body to her husband? Does she have no bodily integrity any longer? And this is actually a Christian concept, right? The doctrine of coverture, the doctrine of one flesh. These are all Christian concepts which were brought to us by Lord Macaulay when Indian Penal Code came to be drafted. And we are still stuck with these, and we say that a married woman should not complain about rape, and institution of marriage needs to be protected. It is, of course, the shell which is going to be protected, but what happens inside, and whether it is mutual trust, mutual respect, mutual love, or whether it is by force and violence, I mean, these are things for us really to think about. Fortunately, it's gone on appeal to the Supreme Court. Supreme Court has admitted the appeal, and it's and issued notice to the central government, and we just have to wait to see how the Supreme Court responds to it. Remission in Bilkis Banu case, the 11 men were actually told that, they were referred to as Sanskari Brahmins. Some of them were not Brahmins, but they were still told that, these are very, very good men. And we must remember that Bilkis Banu incident is a heinous form of gang rape and murder, multiple murders of her entire family members in a communal violence context. And it is the first case of conviction for sexual violence in a communal context, which has happened after more than 5 decades of independence. And in that case, these 11 people have now been let out on remission. So I think, it's there are many things that one can talk about it. I'm going to refrain for now because of lack of time. Witness protection, women's groups' role, the impunity and the brazenness and the arbitrariness of that remission itself. I think there are many things there to be told. And on Muslim women, Kausumi also pointed out about the bully buy and the Sully deals, which is actually auction, online auctioning of Muslim women using their photos from social media without their consent. And we can see how misogyny and hatred for a religious community, how well they come together, they merge and they reinforce each other through these very, very gross forms of violence. But going back a little bit to the remission and this parole issue, I'm sitting in Haryana, and I'm just thinking about Gurmeet Ram Rahim, who is a religious leader and who was convicted of murder, who was convicted of rape, and he has been granted parole thrice in 2021 and thrice in 2022. And what does this really tell us? And whether it is Gurmeet Ram Rahim or it is Asaram Bapu, these religious godmen, despite being convicted for rape, convicted for murder, their disciples and followers are in tens of thousands. Why is it that they still have such a huge following? What does that tell us about the India that we are living in today? I think those are questions for us to really ask ourselves. And just by means of a small interesting tidbit is that Gurmeet Ram Rahim, while he was on parole, he made a video, and this was released on Diwali this year, and that video had more than 4 lakh hits in a single day. So that tells us about the popularity of these godmen, irrespective of the kind of violence that they've inflicted on women. So I think these are some questions for us. And the last issue that I really want to flag is about the chapter on LGBTQI plus community and the kind of violence. And recently we have had the Trans Day of Remembrance, 20th November. So I'm also thinking about that. And it's so important to look at women with a broader definition, going beyond cishet women, but looking at lesbian women, looking at trans women, also looking at gender non-binary, gender non-conforming persons, and the kind of violence that is inflicted on them. If we say that, women find it difficult to report the complaint of rape because of shame and stigma. When it comes to trans women, that kind of shame and stigma and institutional apathy and institutional complicity with violence and sexual violence against them is so much more. And yet it is so undocumented. Some years ago, PUCL Karnataka had come up with a report on violence against transgender persons. I think those kind of reports and documentation are very much required. I just want to flag lastly about the recent Universal Periodic Review, which India had. It took place in November this year, and there have been many concerns which have been. Universal Periodic Review, for those of us who may not be familiar with it, is a kind of peer review by other countries, countries reviewing each other's human rights record and status. And in that, many countries had raised issues about gender-based violence and about violence based on religious affiliation, about minority rights, about freedom of speech and expression, and about overbroad application of anti-terror laws, including UAPA, under which many women have been arrested and are being incarcerated as well. And given the high amount of custodial violence that exists, I think women who are in custody, incarcerated under these laws, are several times more vulnerable to various forms of violence. So I just want to highlight that. And I end my talk with just highlighting that there are limitations in law. Very often, there are things that happen, but then the law is slow to catch up. And, the interpreters of law, who are the courts, the legislators, as well as the law enforcers, are much slower to catch up with what is happening. So law may be part of the solution, but and I'm saying this very consciously, very responsibly, given the fact that I'm a law professor and my discipline is law, and yet I repeatedly feel that law is part of the solution. Sometimes law is the problem, but very often it is part of the solution. But what is really needed is much more of social consciousness and a political action. So when there is social consciousness and political action in addition to law reforms or law implementation, then we can actually see better days and better years ahead in terms of gender-based violence. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Saumya, for that wonderful lecture. I think the first part where you really brought the NCRB data to life, and you gave us some really important context for reading this kind of data, and showing us what the numbers say and also what they don't say. So how to kind of read between the lines when you look at something like NCRB data. And also thanks for that really a wonderful analysis of recent events in the news that we've been seeing, that's on all of our minds, whether it's the Bilkis Banu case or the Shraddha Walkar case, of course, most recently. I think also when you were talking about that case and about marital rape, it's important to remember, I know there was a survey done fairly recently by the National Council for Applied Economic Research that said 95% of married women in India said that they are in marriages to people from the same subcaste. So it's important really to remember that most marriages in India continue to follow these lines. So when you see a case like Shraddha's being kind of weaponized to fuel sort of religious hatred, I think we really again need more context to understand what's going on there. So thank you very much. If anyone has any questions or comments, please either leave them in the chat box or you can feel free to unmute as well. I think we already have quite a few comments. I think Kausumi's made a really important point when she says, when you were talking about custodial rape, she says even among convicts, the death penalty is overwhelmingly given to men from minority communities, Dalits, Muslims, and working class men. I think that's something that we need to remember. We also have a comment from V. Janaki that she says it's horrific, it's far too entrenched beyond sexual violence, and she talks about sort of the other forms of domestic violence at home, emotional abuse, irrespective of marital status of women, is a stark reality. Cybercrime and bullying, stalking, even in the domestic sphere, is rampant. And domestic violence is one of the focus areas of our campaign this year. And if you have a look at our calendar, which has also been shared in the chat, you can see some of the other events that we have if you'd like to attend those as well. Yes, we have quite a few comments here. Is there anything you'd like to respond to, either of you, Saumya or Kausumi, if there was anything else you'd like to add? I think we also have a hand up from Pranay Manjari Samal. You can go ahead and unmute.
Yeah, hello. I think I have a request than a question. My request is, okay, like I'm an aspiring politician. I want to contest election as a city corporator. I want to impact the gender-based violence at the family level in my constituency. Then what are the actionable points that I can choose to implement on ground from today onwards, so that I can prevent? What I understand that ASA and Anganwadi structure has been very, very powerful to reduce health issues among women, because women has the access in case of a health emergency. But when there is violence or abuse, they don't have anyone to get help. While working on ground, like I have been working in the elementary education from 2009 onwards. So yeah, so I know none, like I haven't met any woman who have not gone through violence or abuse in her lifetime. And most of my students' mothers are actually domestic violence victims. I don't know how to help them. Can we create a structure that that also and also the can the research also includes the role of women sarpanches to prevent gender-based violence? Yeah, did you get my
Would you like to respond?
Thank you. I think your part of your question is about including certain aspects in the report. So maybe somebody in Prajnya could, respond to that. In terms of actionable, points at the ground level, particularly for women sarpanch, I think the report, as well as even from other sources, one of the things that we know is the very, very low awareness among women about their rights in relation to violence. So that could be awareness raising, could be one aspect that a sarpanch could take up. The other aspect, I think, is about institutional response. How do we ensure that the institutions respond to women? Because if they do not respond to women, less and less women are going to have confidence in the institutions, whether it is the local panchayat, whether it is the police, the government hospitals, and so on, right? So one of the aspects that the sarpanch could also work on is the institutional response within their constituency. Is it possible to ensure that the persons running the institutions, they get some kind of sensitization? Sensitization is a bad word, but I'm not able to think of anything better, but basically to question their very misogynist and patriarchal thinking. So unless that happens and institutional apathy is countered, more and more women, even if they know their rights, they are going to tolerate the violence because they cannot go to any institutions, because the institutions are careless, or they show no empathy to them, and they do not respond in the way that law mandates them to respond. So they have a duty to respond, right? So it is not a charity that they are doing for women. So I think it is important for the sarpanches to also instill this sense of duty in people running the institutions, whether it is the local police or the panchayats. So those are things that come to my mind immediately, but on inclusion in the report, perhaps Swarna and Kausumi and Shakti may be able to talk about it.
Yeah, thank you.
Kausumi, would you like to go next? Have your hand up.
Yeah, I just had a very small point to make. I mean, obviously, Professor Uma spoke about the larger context, but Prajnya Manju, you asked about, what are the actionable points. I know that recently there has been a research in Madhya Pradesh. It was done by JPAL, and it showed that installing women's help desks in police stations actually had a significant increase in registration of cases than police stations which did not have women's help desk. So I think that's very important to consider. And of course, it's not just about having women's help desks. You have to make sure that they're functional, make sure that there are sensitive, empathetic women police officers in place. But I thought that was a very grounded study, and there are obviously very large scale structural institutional changes that need to be made, but those also will take time. So what are the short-term things that we can do? What are the immediate things we can do? So I think this study was could be very useful. I've pasted the link to it on the chat.
I think Dr. Swarna Rajgopalan also had something to add.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that, Saumya's point about the law being important and implementation being important, institutions matter a great deal. I have no argument with that. But the thing that is breaking my heart every time I am part of a research project around gender-based violence, domestic violence, street harassment, is this normalization that people have internalized. People are not going to access help or law enforcement unless they think there is a problem. If they are raised to think that violence is what you expect from life and violence is what happens to adults, then we have a problem that is just so large and fundamental that I agree with Pranay Manjari. Where do you start? It's how do you convince people to think that there's a problem with their life, that they need to then exercise their rights, go to the police, go to an NGO. And I think that the law helps a great deal. The law is in some places well ahead of where we are in our thinking about what is a good life and what is an acceptable relationship. But this is something that I feel like in all of these years and all of my years, I have still not understood.
Yeah. I think we have a somewhat related question from Jushya Kumar, and an important question. She says, I just had a question about the functioning of LCs, since the redressal mechanism under the POSH Act is much harder to access for informal sector women workers. What is the data saying? Is there any reliable data on the functioning of LCs, and what needs to be done to improve access to LCs? I should say we also have an event coming up on this very topic, I think on the 29th, if I'm not mistaken, of this month, as part of the campaign, where we will be discussing LCs in more detail. It's a webinar, so you can all attend if you'd like to. But would anyone now like to answer this question?
Shakti, my hand was up for the earlier question by Pranay Manjari. That's fine. I just wanted to add one point to what Swarna had pointed out about normalization of violence. Normalization, I mean, there is an internalization of violence by women, right? So we think that domestic violence, for example, is something that we have to put up with, and blaming ourselves for what we are perceived to have not done is part of it. But I think one thing that a sarpanch could also help maybe is to have very informal conversations about how we bring up our boys. How are we bringing them up in a manner that instills a certain sense of, equality and co-sharing and partnership and respecting consent and non-violence, rather than this toxic masculinity, which is about, going to the gym and having muscles and being violent and, overriding consent, and that is being masculine. So this whole concept of masculinity and how we bring up our boys, can we bring up our sons, our brothers, can we help them to respect consent more? Can we help them to be more into nurturing rather than destruction? I've seen small children, small boys who are given these guns and weapons, and then there are other boys who break toys and their parents clap and say, wow, you're being so good because you're breaking a toy and it shows how powerful you are. So I think, can we get children children into gardening and having pets instead, where there is nurturing and care that is required instead of destruction and violence. I mean, these are just some random thoughts, but I think the larger point is we have to question ourselves about how these men are being created, who are inflicting these varied forms of violence on women, and what can be done about that at the ground level.
Would anyone like to respond to the question on local committees?
Shall I just
Yes, please
say,
go ahead. Yeah.
there's actually very little data on local committees, Tricia. And there is also very little information on where your local committee sits. So leave alone accessing it, you have to find it. We ran an RTI petition a couple of years ago. And in response to our petition, which asked, what is the local committee in this district? People actually gave us contact information for members of their internal committees, which is wrong on so many levels. So I think that there is a lack of understanding of what the obligation is. There is a lack of understanding of how this law is meant to work, because if you just have a local committee at the district headquarters, nobody earning a daily wage is going to have the time and energy to come make a complaint on what has in fact been normalized in our society. Men who gawk, men who grope, men who gape, men who catcall. This is life. So no one is going to travel 5 hours to a district headquarters to file a complaint and then come back another day for a hearing. So I think that we have to ask very fundamental questions about how this provision is meant to work, how it is in fact implemented, and where your local committee is if you do need to access it. And I think that there's a reason why we still have workplace harassment cases registered in the police. Sometimes the police are the easiest people to find.
Does anyone else have any questions? I did have one question. I think if we don't have any more in the chat, or if nobody else in the audience would like to ask something, I was thinking, especially Saumya, when you were talking about custodial rape, I know the number of cases that are registered. I was thinking of course, a recent case in Tamil Nadu of Jairaj and Benix. And what this tells us about how rape is, in the language that's used in rape laws on gender neutrality or a lack of gender neutrality. And, I just was wondering what your thoughts are on this, perhaps what are the conventions in other countries in terms of, making rape laws more gender neutral or not? And what do you think we should be doing going forward in Indian law as well?
Thanks, Shakti. I think that's it's a question which at least the Indian women's movements have been grappling with for quite long, even before the 2013 amendments to rape law that happened with Justice Verma committee as well. There have been many recommendations which were made about whether to make rape law gender neutral or not. I remember being part of these discussions with women's groups for much longer, much before the homicidal gang rape and murder of a young woman in the moving bus in Delhi. Much before that, we were discussing rape law reform, and at that time, it was one of the aspects that was discussed is that if rape is about power, and of course, we believe that rape is about power and not about sex, right? So it's not about lust, uncontrollable lust, which men are supposed to have, but it is about power. And it is very possible that in custody, in custodial situations, it is possible that men too can face various forms of sexual violence. In fact, there are some unconfirmed reports that this has been happening in militarized areas, right, in India. And also I remember being a part of these there were these people's tribunals on torture, against torture, which was organized by People's Watch Tamil Nadu several years ago. And there was one tribunal which was held in Madurai, where I was part of the jury. And this was, there were many cases related to the anti-Veerappan operations, where there was a joint special task force set up by the governments of Karnataka and Tamil Nadu to catch Veerappan. And at that time, there were actually, something like torture cells, huge torture cells, which were created in these border areas where men, women, children were taken there and they were tortured to give evidence, to give information about Veerappan. In order that he can be caught. And much of that torture was sexual in nature, and the sexual and gender-based violence there was not limited to only women, but it was also on men. For example, electrocution of men's sexual organ and so on. So I think that the women's movements were quite clear that in custodial situations, rape and sexual violence, can be, men can be subjected to this as well. So that is one aspect of it. The other aspect is when we say women, can we also, this is my thought, that when we say women, can we also broadly define it beyond, cisgendered, heterosexual women? Can we make it broader? Because then the kind of transphobia and the kind of, trans women, the kind of sexual violence and other forms of violence that trans women face and so on, that could also be brought in. The third aspect is, do we make the victim gender neutral, or do we make the perpetrator gender neutral, and in what context? So there are debates and discourses on it. I don't, my position is that as far as custodial violence is concerned, any form of custody, I think even a woman who is there as the custodian, whether it's an army personnel, a police officer, there is a certain kind of power, and so that power needs to be recognized. Broadly defining women is definitely something I'm for. But making rape law completely gender neutral and saying both victims and perpetrators can be anybody, I'm not sure that captures the when the society is so unequal. How do we then, are we just brushing that under the carpet? And does neutrality mean equality? Those are some of my thoughts on it. Yeah.
Thanks very much. I think we just have one final question before we wrap up. It's from Sarda U. Again, an important question about media reportage of gender-based violence. They're talking specifically about Shraddha, again, the Shraddha Walker murder and how it's been reported on. They say it's attracted flack for excessively focusing on morbid details without respecting the victim, and the approach is very voyeuristic. I also failed to identify domestic violence and misogyny as a root cause, but look at it as a standalone crime. So I know that I can see both Kausumi and Dr. Rajgopalan have shared resources in the chat for anyone who would like to know more about how we can report sensitively. But do either you, Saumya or Kausumi, have any further points you might like to add, perhaps?
I just want to say that I agree with what Sarda is saying here, that they don't really identify. These media reports are not talking about intimate partner violence. They're not talking about domestic violence. They're not talking about misogyny. And they are making it out to be one Muslim man being barbaric to his partner and casting aspersions on all Muslim men because of that. But beyond that, it's really not doing anything more. And I agree that it's getting very, very voyeuristic day by day about how the man had other women in the same house after he had killed this woman. And why do we need to know that? Why do we need to know whether he had relationships with other women or not? How is that going to help us deal with with the barbarity of this particular crime? So I think it is getting very voyeuristic. I think there is a huge amount of misogyny involved in it. I think there was a lot of suspicion. There was stalking. There were many things that were going wrong in that relationship. I just feel terribly, terribly sad that if only this woman had parental support, maybe she could have extricated herself from this relationship. And she may have, today she may be alive, but because she had no real support in that sense. And it just kind of, I'm thinking about all those women who are trapped in choice relationships. They have entered into relationships out of their own choice, going against their parents' wishes, and they've lost parental support. And when something goes wrong in that relationship, who do they turn to? They can't turn to their parents. They can't go to institutions. And then it can lead to a situation like what happened to Shraddha. So I think it's important for all of us to wake up as parents, as people working in institutions as well. But yeah, I just agree with what Sarda has said here.